Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on whatever time you are watching this pre-recorded lecture on our discussions on philosophy of man. Before we begin into our second lesson, that being the Pre-Socratics, I would like to recall the previous discussion or the previous lecture, which was more or less on understanding philosophy, or basically understanding the need for a definition before you try and understand the subject of the course you are trying to take. Okay, so definition is important simply because you cannot delve into a certain topic without thinking what is the main purpose of what you're doing. Okay? You don't go you don't enroll into criminology thinking that you're going to be a doctor, diba? You don't go into studying biology if you think you're going to be serving the country as a soldier, right? So, by definition, we try to look and consider certain concepts, and with that, by understanding the definition, we then look into how human nature and humanity in general try to understand the world they are living in. Just as much as you are trying to understand why you are here right now, why you are part of this class in the first place. So if you, especially why you consider that maybe there are some classes that their school requires, but you think it's useless. And basically, these are basically the questions as to why we are who we are. Okay, we understand how we prioritize certain aspects of our lives or certain concepts that we think we prioritize as more important than other things, right? So by definition, by looking into the definition of the thing into certain realities that you are joining, you will end up thinking everything, at the end of the day, everything has its own importance, whether you value it or not. And that is why we have to look into certain definitions, okay? So that was the nutshell of the previous video lecture. Now, before we go into the Pre-Socratics, I would like to look into our very first, how do we say this? Thought experiment. Okay, so when I say thought experiment, these are the things I usually post on the classroom stream, and it also serves as your attendance. And by attendance, it means that, of course, since we are a discipline that demands interaction, then we're going to have to interact as much as we can given the circumstances we're in. Okay? So kung bisayon pa, of course, pag philosophy mong go, dili man gud siya basta lang sabot ka sa usa ka theory. It's not about the theory more or less, but how you understand the theory. Kung ikaw mismo wala ka kasabot sa ginabasa nimo, unsay point kung magtuon pa ka, di ba? Unsay point na naa pa ka diri. Okay? So of course, there will be things that we won't understand, and that will be understandable simply because these are things that are mostly not relevant anymore to us. Okay? So going back, let's look into your classroom stream. Okay? So if you recall the question was, okay, diba? So we were asking here, who achieves more in life? Those who consider the consequences before acting, or those who take actions without thinking? Okay? So it's a pretty straightforward question, di ba? Kinsay mas naimakamtan sa kinabuhi? Okay? Sinong mas lamang sa buhay? Yung mga tao na iniisip mo na yung anong posible mangyari bago niya gawin ang gusto niyang gawin? Or yung tao nang ginagawa niya kahit na walang pag-isip-isip na? Okay? So, let us look and consider these answers. Okay, so there are 7 of you in this class, and I appreciate the fact that all of you are answering, and trying to interact as much as you can. Of course, I would appreciate it most of all if you, of course, I'm not saying that none of you put effort, pero there are times na I can understand siguro gahabol mo sa data or sa internet connection, so you try to make your answer as quick and concise as possible. But anyway, let's look into these answers. Okay, so total kita raman no. Of course, this is actually going to YouTube, but it's okay. The thing is, your ideas are still important, whether you think maulog or dili. It's okay. So first and foremost, for me, those who consider the consequence before acting, they are the ones who achieve more in life because in every action that they will be taking, they think of it carefully. Okay, very good. So if a person thinks that action without thinking is easier to achieve a glamour life, for me, that actions without thinking may result in frustration, consequences. Not all person can handle the results of consequences due to self-aggrandize. Okay, from what I've understood, siguro I think Sir Mr. Muhammad here is trying to tell us that, okay, a person in the end, someone who actually thinks before he acts is someone who does not think before acting assumes that he will have a bigger achievement. So siguro what he's trying to say is that there will be times that how we try to look into certain aspects in life, we tend to think that we tend to overthink that we can do it without thinking there are consequences to certain actions. Okay, so kudos to the first two. Next, if you start thinking of consequences of each and every action, you will probably end up doing nothing except worrying, accompanied by loss of sleep, depression, loss of appetite, etc. We must accept that the consequences are a result of many factors. Some of these factors are in our control and some are not. It is then each individual's choice whether to pursue uncontrollable factors or concrete on the action and the manner of performing the action. At each step, we need to choose to act or to think, although a little bit of thinking is required before any action. But excessive thinking will only have negative effects, and moreover, we will end up on the losing side. Just keep the thinking simple and to the point and act fearlessly. Very good. That is wonderfully said. Okay. Alright, very good, very good. So it's true, no? It's true. So what we can learn from this third answer is that there is no particular absolutely correct answer given a certain situation. Okay? Nakadepende sa sitwasyon kung anong karapat-dapat na answer mo, di ba? Of course, it's okay to think of the consequences before you act. However, if you overstate the consequences and because you think too much of the consequence, you might end up doing nothing at all, which is correct. And usually, one of the biggest hindrances of our freedom is the fact that we're afraid of consequences, right? Like, if there are some things that make you afraid to do certain things, then that's simply because of your fear. I'm gonna afraid to do certain things now. So we fail to act simply because we think too much. Right? So there's a time to think and there's a time to act. So that's basically the summary of this third answer. Very well said. Okay. In this new normal, those who consider the consequences before acting. Okay. Why? There is always consequence to your actions. Before you act, make it sure you're prepared for them. We all make choices, but in the end, our choices make us. When you choose an action, you choose the consequences of that action. When you desire a consequence you had done well, better take the action that would create it. We are free to choose our paths, but we can't choose the consequences that come with them. Always bear in mind that everything falls into better or worse when you decide to take that kind of actions. Very well said. Very good. Okay. I like to appreciate this answer now because yeah, it's true, especially in this time of pandemic now. The things we do will always affect other people, right? So like if you go out of your house knowing that the virus is out there and you don't know who has the virus, you end up being an ass because depending on what you're doing outside, right? If you have people at home or your lolo or lola, some kids, then ikaw magawas ka simply because you want to have fun, then you don't know that your actions might end up causing your family to have the virus, to be infected, right? Tama, very good, well said. Okay, so we are free to choose our own path, very good, but we can't choose the consequences that come with them. Alright, true, very true. Okay, like what a good, if you have sex with your girlfriend, then don't expect to be free of the consequences. Okay, whether or not your girlfriend gets pregnant, you still have to deal with the fact that there is a psychological effect to that action you did, simply because you're not married, diba? Okay, so there is always more to things than certain physical consequences, diba? There are also consequences that are emotional, psychological, and these are the things that tend to make or break a human being, diba? If you use someone, kung mugamit ka sa tao for the sake lang, for your own personal desires, then what kind of person does that make you, right? Like kung manguyabra ka para lang sorry for the term, para lang makatilaw, then there is particularly something wrong with your mindset or the way you think, right? So whatever happens after you commit to that act, then you have no choice but to accept the consequences, right? Very well said, thank you. This is Cristobal, the one above is Kagob. Okay. Next we have Omel Kair Makil. For me, the one who achieve more in life are those who consider the consequences before acting, because they think carefully before they act. Consequences are where our thoughts and actions meets reality. We can't always foresee all the consequences of our action, and trying to be sure we are doing the right thing. Very good. That's right. Also, very good answer. Consequences are where our thoughts and actions meets reality. That's a good way to think of consequences, no? Yeah, that what you do and the result of what you do is going to be your reality. Yeah. Good, very good. Next, for me, those who consider the consequences before acting are the ones who achieve more in life because they think first, carefully. That's what's the outcome before they take actions. Okay, good. I am so sorry, I already gave it. Okay, so this is. Let's not look into that. Anyway, wait. I think let's not look at the one. I think the one who accept consequences before acting those things because they think that it's better to face those consequences, and after that they would achieve what they want to in their lives. Then who take action without thinking. For example, if you're going to take action without thinking, so you don't know the path you go and it is useless. Okay, that's well said as well. Alright, of all the 7 students here, I'd like to commend all of you for your good answers, which I believe are good simply because they come from you and you took the effort to actually think of your answers. Okay, so we do not look here at the grammar. No, this is not an English class, even though I'm speaking English. So as a student of philosophy myself, I will never claim that I'm a philosopher simply because I do not claim to have all the wisdom of the world. Okay? So together let us learn and understand even more why we have to look into the history of how we come to think the way we think. Okay? So basically the way we think now is a result of how people thought centuries before. Before we were born, before we had a concept of religion, before we had a concept of good governance, before we had all this political nonsense happening to us now, the world had a different problem before, and that was to answer the most fundamental understanding of human nature as well as human existence. And here we go into a period in which it is more or less immortalized in our history books as well as in textbooks. Okay, so just to be clear, philosophy is not the how do we say this? Philosophy is not the possession of any kind of political power. Philosophy goes beyond any concept of politics or agendas. Okay, so when we look at the pre-Socratic philosophers, these are basically the philosophers of ancient Greece. Okay, so when we say Greece, this is basically in Europe. Okay, but it doesn't mean that philosophy started in Europe. Philosophy, every culture, every tribe. This was discussed in the previous lecture. Every culture, every tribe, every religious tradition has their own philosophy, and each philosophy is how people cope. Let's use the word cope for the sake of for the lack of a better term now. So because in the ancient times, I mean even to us now, there is a sort of question as to why we exist in the first place, right? And even you individually now, as you face your monitor, cursing at your internet connection or getting mad at your teacher because I am forcing you to watch this video, so that you would at least have a fighting chance to pass the subject during a time of pandemic, you would ask yourselves why, and basically it all starts with the question of why. Why do I exist? Why does the rain fall? Why ngano sakit ang kalayo? Ngano bahala gibuhatan ako tanan dili gyapon enough? Marigyan bitan ang pangutana. These are questions that stem from ages past. Mga panahon na bahalag wala pa ta na tao, gina-experience gyapon ni sa mga tao na niuna sa tuwa. Okay? So when we look at the pre-Socratic philosophers, take note that there is a specific word that is of interest to us, and that is the name Socrates. Okay, Socrates, the reason why there is a period that revolves around a certain philosopher, and this philosopher being Socrates, is the reason the reason why Socrates is such a powerful name in ancient philosophy is because he is the one who changed the way we ought to debate, the way we ought to think. But Socrates belongs to his own time. So the pre-Socratic philosophers are actually people who, of course, are either contemporaries of Socrates or they are people who lived before the time of Socrates. Okay, so there are actually around a few Socratic philosophers that we need to discuss. Not because they're basically important. I mean, yeah, they're basically important, but as Filipinos know, these people, if you did your research as I asked you, then you might think that these are crazy people, because in some way, a lot of philosophers tend to be crazy in their ideas, right? So let's look into what this era entails. Okay, so we begin our study of philosophy in ancient Greece, not because they were the first civilization to have philosophy, but because the notion of a systematized body of knowledge in the West was recorded in this era. Okay, so when we say systematized body of knowledge, this was a time when people spoke, when philosophers spoke, they gave ideas. There are people who are writing down what these people are saying. So basically, murag kung unsay ginabuhat nato sa una kung wala pay pandemic, mo ginabuhat sa mga ancient Greeks. Okay, when someone spoke and they believe that there is value to what the person is speaking, then they will write it down. Okay, so that is why there are ancient texts, ancient books of that time, and we still have copies of that now, because we understand how the ancients thought simply because of the recorded systematized body of knowledge that they kept. Okay, so again we begin with the pre-Socratic philosophers. So what was the concern of the pre-Socratic philosophers? Okay, so every era in human history faced a certain question. During the ancient period, when civilizations believed in the multiplicity of gods and goddesses, Okay, in other words, there is a polytheistic worldview. There is a belief that in every aspect of nature, in every aspect of reality, there are certain gods or goddesses or spirits or even demons that are attributed to this so-called reality. So, diba, if we look at our own mythology before the pre-colonial times, basically every culture before there was the concept of a monotheistic god, each tribe had their own gods and goddesses. Okay, like the immortalized so-called Filipino deities are more or less more on the Tagalog mythologies. Okay, kaya mostly the mythologies of Mindanao and Visayas have been overshadowed by these concepts. Diba? So, when you think of it, like we have ang alamat ni malakas at maganda, diba? Basically, how a Filipinized creation story, diba? Or the fact, or the myth of the Bakunawa. So these are things that ancient people attributed to certain realities, right? So they began to question the existence of the gods and goddesses and delve into the question of the origin of life. Okay. So basically, of course, now when as humanity progressed throughout history, whatever was established prior to any given thought, or kung unsay naandan along the way, bahalag pila na katuig nilabay, nadyoy someone at some point makapangutana kung sakto ba ni ang ginabuhat sa daghan, sa karaghanan, diba? And basically, these are things that are basically normal, diba? Kay every kind of progress or in human development always begins with a question: is what we believe correct? Sakto ba ang akong ginatuuhan? Sakto bang ginatuuhan sa akong komunidad? Okay? So again, they began to question the existence of gods and goddesses, and there are some, though, during that time they would still believe in the gods and goddesses. However, they would reconsider the concept and think, it wasn't the gods and goddesses who did this, rather it's basically just the force of nature. Okay? And with that, they ended up questioning the origin of life. Okay? So, in other words, they were questioning the origin or how things came into order. Okay? So, if you remember the previous video, if you watched it at all, then at the end of the slides, there was a question, or there was a summary of the focus of the 4 eras that we're going to look into. So the first era is the era of ancient philosophy, and the focus of ancient philosophy is that the center of its question is the question of the cosmos. In other words, it is cosmocentric. Okay, so when we say cosmocentric, cosmo means order. Okay, and so the opposite of cosmos is chaos. So when we say chaos, it's gubot. Gubot sama sa imong kwarto. Okay, kung gubot imong kwarto. Pero kung hanay po imong kwarto, then that is what we call cosmos. Okay, so ancient philosophy is focused on the cosmos, cosmocentric. What gives order to nature? What gives order to the human person? Alright? So, with that order, we have what we call the arche. Arche. So, the arche is basically the basic substance, the basic matter in which all life originates. Okay? So, when learned Greeks began to question the gods, they looked towards the most basic principles. In other words, they sought the origin of all life. So when I say principles now, and that's I do not refer to the mga prinsipyo sa isikataw. When I say principles now, it's more or less it can be likened to the basic matter. Okay, when we say matter, whether it's solid, liquid, gas, may nga bitaw, that is matter. Okay, So they sought the origin of life. Ahagikan ang kinabuhi. Aha ni originate. Okay? So they sought to understand the origins of all life by trying to figure out the basic principles of life. They call the arche, or the basic principle, or the basic or fundamental principle of life. Okay, so we use the word principle, not matter, because there are some philosophers who say that ang elements may gahimo. There are some who say that there are more transcendent principles. So we use the word principle, not matter, because for some philosophers they would how would you say this? They would consider that the origin of life is not about the physical matter that makes up life. But let's look into these philosophers in order for us to understand a bit more. Okay? So first and foremost, we have Thales of Miletus. Thales or Thales for some. Okay? He, Aristotle is a post-Socratic philosopher. A side note first, most of these philosophers we will mention are mentioned in the works of the post-Socratic philosophers, or I mean by the Socratic philosophers. Basically, the Socratic philosophers are Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Okay? Okay. No, I'm sorry. The post-Socratic, because Aristotle came after Socrates. Okay? So, Aristotle, who wrote down some of the things Thales said, he says this. So he commenced his investigation of the wisdom of the philosophers who preceded him with Thales, the first philosopher, and described Thales as the founder of natural philosophy. He recorded Thales says that it is water. It is the nature, the arche, the originating principle. For Thales, this nature was a single material substance, water. Okay, so Thales, as he went along, okay, disclaimer muna, we're not going to go too deep into their understanding of how they came into their theory now, because we're just going to have a big headache. So disclaimer, this isn't going to be a very detailed look into the philosophers, because first and foremost, not everyone is interested. Okay, so for Thales, it is water. The arche is water. Okay, again, arche is the basic substance or the basic principle. So for Thales, the reason why water is considered the basic principle or the origin of life is simply because everything we consume has water in it. Okay, so after it rains, kokak ang mga palaka, diba? So morbitag ang iyang concept. The concept there is, after the rain, there is always life that springs forth from the rain. Okay, if you're thirsty, you have to drink water, otherwise you die. Okay, when we eat, even the food we eat, the dry food we eat, has some water in it, right? So basically, for even our blood, okay, our blood is liquid, and when it's liquid, it's always associated with water. But anyway, so water is basically the substance that creates life, according to Thales, since it is the one that when you water plants, the plants bear fruit. When there's a fire and the fire threatens to kill you, buhusin mo lang ng tubig, mawala ang fire, di ba? So for Thales, the element of water, the actual element of water, as in ang tubig dun mismo, is where all life comes from. Okay, with that, from water, as life progresses, water formed into certain realities. Okay, that is for Thales. Okay, again, we'll not go too deep into that. Basta ang importante, ang arche ni Thales is water. Okay, the element water. Again, why? Simply because without water, there can be no life. So since iyang conclusion is that since without water we cannot live, like, okay, like for example, I have to drink water now because my throat hurts. Sorry, this will still go into the video, so bahala na. Okay, so without drinking water, then my throat would have still been dry, and I would have died later on if I stopped drinking water at all. Okay, so the origin, according to Thales, is the origin of life is water, simply because with water, life follows. Right? That is Thales. The second pre-Socratic philosopher is Anaximander. Okay, so the arche for Anaximander is called the boundless. Boundless. So what is boundless here? If you look into the dictionary, the word boundless simply means that there is no bounds. Wala siya boundary. There is an eternity in the boundless. Okay? Again, diba, like for example, if you look at this pen, then there's a boundary here. Ang boundary ana is where the pen ends. Okay? So kung mosugo lang pen diri mo, end gyapon siya diri. So these are the boundaries for us to know that this is a pen. Okay? So for Anaximander, ang origin has to be boundless. The concept of eternity. The concept that there is no na walay hadlang ang pag-expound and extract and expound sa realidad. Okay? So according to Anaximander, since the boundless is eternal, then the boundless has no origin. Simply because kung mauni ang origin, dapat ang origin walay origin. Okay? So the boundless must be boundless. In other words, ang boundless, the concept of boundless has to be itself without bounds. Dapat the concept of eternity continues in our definition of understanding where the origin comes from, where the origin of life is. Okay? How he comes into that? Let's just simply put that with life, the concept of eternity is a seed that brings forth life. Okay? So even though ang tao, the mortal man, is himself bounded by his life, the concept of humanity is boundless. Okay? Simply because there is life in the human. Okay? And likewise, since life is boundless, death will always be a part of life. Therefore, it is still part of that sense of eternity. Okay? So I hope while you're watching, kaya pa. Okay? So that is the second pre-Socratic. So the third pre-Socratic is Anaximenes. Okay? So Anaximenes seems to have held that at one time everything was air. Okay? So the first pre-Socratic believed that the arche was water. The second believed in that the arche was what we call the boundless. Okay? Our third pre-Socratic philosopher believed that everything was air. Okay? The origin was air. Okay? So air can be thought of as a kind of neutral stuff that is found everywhere and is available to participate in physical process. Natural forces constantly act on the air and transform it into other materials, which came together to form the organized world. In early Greek literature, air is associated with the soul, or the birth of life. Okay? And Anaximenes may have thought of air as capable of directing its own development as the soul controls the body. Okay. So if we look at science now, we know that in every layer of the atmosphere, the molecules that comprise the air within that certain layer compresses. If not I'm not a science major. Basically, the molecules in certain layers in the air vary from each layer. Okay, so the nearer you are to the earth, the looser the molecules. Okay, the higher you go up to space, the more dense the molecules of those layers are. Alright? So this particular concept, though it was not Anaximenes who thought of it, but it was basically a similar concept to what he was trying to say. Okay? So since air varies in certain degrees, siguro not air mismo, pero the molecules that comprise air has the opportunity to condense and become something physical, according to him. Therefore, since it is air that brings forth life, then since it is air that gives us the physical form, simply because ang air daw kay associated sa kalag, sa soul. It is the breath of life. So when you, despite the physical form we have, inside is the soul, and the soul is basically what breathes for us. Okay, so this is not the same understanding of the soul as Christians and Muslims have about the soul. Okay, this is a soul that is far divorced from how we understand it in the modern, in our contemporary times. Okay, so, and the important thing is, for Anaximenes, the arche, or the basic substance of life, is air. Alright, so we have water, boundless air. The third philosopher is Pythagoras. Okay, so Pythagoras is, of course, someone you know in your mathematics class as the one who created the Pythagorean theorem. Okay, but of course, our concern is not so much in mathematics. I mean, it's still involved, but more or less how he understood life, or how he understood the origin of life, is more or less more of a mathematical approach. Okay, so of course he discovered the Pythagorean theorem and mathematical basis of music. So he made a flying leap to infer that all things somehow are. Okay, so are composed of, or are governed by, numbers. Okay, things somehow are. So when you say are, it means it either means saying things that are composed of or governed by. Okay, so things, according things, reality, are basically governed or composed of numbers. Okay, why numbers? For simply put, let's just say that he viewed everything as an equation. Okay, so like for example, how to make life, 1 egg and 1 sperm equals human. Okay, that's a very bad description. I mean, I'm not really giving justice to how these people actually thought, no, and we're just putting it in a nutshell in order for us to understand. Okay, so in retrospect, a way of groping toward the formal as opposed to the material aspect of things, he more or less took into consideration the form of certain realities. So what comprises a human being? A certain amount of blood, a certain amount of iron, a certain amount of this and that, and you have a human. What comprises a match? A wooden stick, and some phosphorus at the end, then you have a match. Okay, so it's basically, these things are, when you add things together, these are the things that comprise or govern life. And with that principle, for Pythagoras, ang basic na pag-create sa life falls under the principles of numbers. Okay, the more you add to certain things, the more that there is something being created or destroyed, being created. The moment you take away a certain aspect, diba? Plus minus, maranya na bitaw. The moment you take away a certain aspect of that reality dies. Okay? I take, for example, if you take away my brain now, as I am speaking, as in anak na din ng utok, you deduct my brain from my being, then I lose life. Diba? Same thing goes for my heart, same thing goes for, if whatever thing you take away from my human body, the moment you take it away, then you are basically subtracting my life. Right? So, that is basically how he understood. That's basically how he tries to subscribe to the concept of numbers as the origin of life. Okay, So now we had water, the RK. First we had water, then we had boundless, and we have air. Now our fourth RK is numbers. Okay. Next we have Heraclitus. Okay, the doctrine of change. Okay. Okay. So the doctrine of change, represented by fire, imposes the idea that the only constant notion of life is change. Okay. So Heraclitus states that you cannot walk into the same river twice. Alright. So basically ang Heraclitus no, ang element na iyang gisubscribe to is fire. Okay? So not the elemental fire, but the fact that fire tends to change the original composition of certain materials. Okay? So kung sunugon nimong papel, malamang it becomes black or it disintegrates. If you burn wood, it turns black. If you burn white, it becomes brown, diba? If you burn something black, it becomes even more black, if that's possible. So the RK of Heraclitus is fire. Again, not the elemental fire, dili ang kalayo mismo, pero the concept na the moment na mo sunog kag butang, magbag-o ang iyang reality. Okay? I mean, not siguro not the reality, pero the fact is that it changes. Okay? So for Heraclitus, the concept here is that there are things that change, and since change is constant, then change is the basis of life. Okay? So kung sa una walay butang, then since constant man ang change, then all of a sudden there is something. From nothing there is something, and within that something, since there is constant change, there is always something that is being created, there is always something that dies, and so on and so forth. So we have this notion of change. Okay, the element of fire teaches us that nothing lasts, nothing will stay the same for a given period of time. Okay, like for example, kung last year kay normal pa tong klase, this year ka pandemic na ta. Okay, sa una first year ka, karon third year ka, or things like that. Sa una high school ka, karon college na ka. Karon college na ka, basing pohon, graduate na ka. Okay? So everything changes. You cannot walk into the same river twice. Okay? The moment water will always flow, diba? River daw ni kunuhay. And since the river is always flowing, the moment you walk at this part and you cross, the part na kung aha ka ni tumba will already be at the other end of the river. So the moment you come back, then that is no longer the same river, right? So that's basically the concept of Heraclitus, that the RK is change, the RK is fire. Okay, the concept of change is embedded in the in the principles of fire. Okay, all right, kaya pa ba? Okay, next we have Parmenides. Okay, so if you're having a hard time now, just you can go back, you can rewind. Alright, so Parmenides argued that the everyday perception of the reality of the physical world is mistaken, and that the reality of the world is the one, an unchanging, ungenerated, indestructible whole. Likewise, the phenomena of movement and change are simply appearances of the real static, eternal reality. He further asserted that the truth cannot be known through sensory perception, only through pure reason, or logos. Okay, so here Heraclitus says reality is change, reality is fire that changes everything. That is the RK, that is the basic principle of life. For Parmenides, that isn't the case. So for him, what we think is change is actually the same thing. Okay, so even if you burn this ball pen that I have in the tip of my two fingers, even if you burn this will always be a ball pen. Okay, even if malanay ni siya, even if dili na ka makasulat, it will not change the fact that this is a pen. Okay, so the concept of the one, okay, the one, it's siguro the one can be, we can, in the future the one will end up becoming what we know as God, but let's not look into that yet. Okay, the one, okay, is an unchanging, Okay? Ungenerated, indestructible whole. Unchanging, of course, it means that dili siya magbago. Okay? Ungenerated, in other words, it doesn't come from anything or anyone else. Okay? Indestructible whole. It is a reality. It is a thing that cannot be destroyed. Excuse me. So therefore, ang phenomenon nagalihok ko, okay, the fact that my hands are moving before your eyes, is that it is just an appearance of the real static. So when we say static, no, when we say static, it's more or less something that doesn't move. Okay, static. Nara siya dira. Diba? So, diba, I'm not sure if you're as old as I am, kung kaabot pa mo sa panahon na wala pa yung Netflix, na wala pa yung smart TV, kung walay signal ang cable, then there is static. Okay? It kada bitaw mag-white na murag snow na mag okay? For Parmenides, the one is something like that. It is static. It actually is not moving. It just looks like it's moving. Yan na bitaw. It appears to be moving. The dots on the screen appear to be changing position, pero it is still the same thing. It just looks like it's moving. That's what I mean by static. And that is the eternal reality. Where we are now, 100 years from now, it will still be like that. Okay? A 13-year-old will always be a 13-year-old in the succeeding years. Okay? It doesn't individually, of course, that's not true. But being a 13-year-old will be consistent until 1,000 years that will pass. Okay? In other words, ang batasan sa usa ka bata mao ra gyapon na hangtod sa hangtod. Okay? Ang batasan sa usa ka tawo maudod na hangtod sa hangtod. Ang batasan sa usa ka tiguang maudod na hangtod sa hangtod. Okay? So even though it appears that the human being is the one that is changing, the fact that this process is the same from one generation to the next is a fact for him that humanity doesn't change. Okay? Moagi jud ta sa same process. Okay? Moagi jud ta sa pagkabata, moagi ta sa pagkaway buot, moagi ta sa permita kasab-an, moagi ta sa pagmature, moagi ta sa kamatayon. And that process will repeat and repeat and repeat. And that is what we mean by static. That is the eternal reality according to to Parmenides. The one is something that doesn't change, and therefore the one is the basic principle. It is the RK. Okay. Again, if you're having a hard time, you can repeat. Okay. So we continue. The next one, we have Anaxagoras. Okay, so medyo absurd yung mga names, no? Pero this was a time that is different, and this is not even our culture anyway, so di ta ka-judge sila mga ngalan. Okay, according to Anaxagoras, the agent responsible for the rotation and separation of the primordial mixture is mind, or the nous. Okay, and when mind began to cause motion, separating off proceeded to occur from all that was moved, and all that mind moved was separated apart, and as things were being moved and separated apart, the rotation caused much more separating apart to occur. You can pause and read that again. Okay, the mind serves simply as the initial cause for the motion. And once the rotation is occurring, the momentum sets everything else into place. The mind is depicted as ruling the rotation and settling everything in order, as well as having supreme power and knowledge of all things. In this case, it is tempting to characterize mind in theistic terms. In fact, the uniqueness of Anaxagoras is that he proposed a rationalistic governing principle that remained free from the mythical or theological characteristics of prior cosmogonies. Okay, so the mind, basically, for Anaxagoras, no, this is the closest thing that we can relate to to how we understand God as Christians, Muslims, Jews, or in other words, how we view God is similar to how Anaxagoras explains nous, or the mind. Okay? So ang mind is something that is beyond. Okay? Something that controls everything. Okay? And every movement is created because the mind thinks about it. Okay? And since the mind is the one na maoy gapalihok sa tanan, it is the thing, it is the reality that makes things move, then it is what moves everything and puts everything into place. Okay? Libog no? So in other words, for him, everything was put into this one context, this one element that is not the element, no, this one reality, quote unquote reality, which is the mind or the nous. And the mind being inside this big clump of things, thought, okay, siguro thought is not the word, caused the motion, or mo hinugdan sa paglihok, everything ended up separating and kept on separating. Okay? So how do we try and characterize this? Okay, so think of the creation story in the Quran and the Bible. Okay? I mean, it's basically similar. Okay? So characterize the mind or the nous as the character of God. Okay? So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and when God spoke, there was light, there was life. Okay? So it was with that cause to move ang hinungdan nga namulihok, then it is with that everything fell into place. Dira mo padayon ang pag-separate o take apart sa mga butang. Okay? So, diba, if you look at scripture, whether it's the Quran or the Bible, or God separated the sun from the moon, and the firmament of heaven, and the water was placed in a basin, which we call the ocean, that separates the dry land, and within the dry land there are animals, just as there are animals in the ocean. So this is what it means to basically have things go on being separated from throughout the process of existence. Okay, so it is the mind that rules this common phenomenon, or this repeating phenomenon, na mao ang consistent na pag-separate, mao ang consistent na pagpadayon sa padayon sa kinabuhi, or the continuation of life. Okay, so for Anaxagoras, he's one of the first who actually tried to divorce the concept of the mythical theology of the time. Okay, so for them, during that time, kung mag-lightning o thunder, then nasuko si Zeus. Okay, kung na-in love ka, tugod na ni Aphrodite. So whatever. Okay, so whatever other reason that you can give, diba? So if nindot imong party, then it's because of this god. If maayo imong marriage, it's because of this goddess. Okay, so he took a more rationalistic approach and said that the mind is the one that governs everything. Then gitangtang niya ning concept na ay gods and goddesses na maoy go-govern sa kalibutan, because for him it was not the gods and goddesses, but it was the nous, the mind. And because there is a mind, then that is the cause of every movement on earth. Alright? So we continue. Okay? So now, for this RK, the term is the mind, or nous. Okay? Now we have Empedocles. Not Empedocles, Empedocles. Okay? Like many of the other Pre-Socratics, he found Parmenides' claim that change is impossible. unacceptable. So, kinsa si Parmenides, di ba? He's the one about the one. Okay? He's the one who said the one is the RK, the one. Okay? So, if you're still lost with that, you can repeat the video. Okay? So, para sa iya, si Parmenides, ang concept na dili posible ang change kay dili jud katanggap-tanggap. Okay? So, he tried to find the basis of all change. Excuse me. Starting from the assumption passed down from the Eleatics, which we know we don't need to look into, that existence cannot pass into non-existence or vice versa. Okay? So, ang assumption from the Eleatics is that ang pag-exist dili siya basta-basta then mawala siya, di ba? You cannot just exist then di lang ka mo exist. Okay? Or likewise, ang butang na wala ga-exist dili siya pwede mo exist o giyaha lang. Okay? Like for example, the concept of a three-headed dog does not exist. Siguro ga-exist siya sa imong mind, pero wala din siya ga-exist in reality. Okay? So, Empedocles held that change, including what we call coming into existence and death, is only the mixture and separation of the four indestructible and unchangeable elements, or roots, as he called them. Okay? So, earth, air, fire, and water. Right? He posted two divine powers, love and strife, which pervade the universe and act as the moving powers, which bring about the mixtures and separations. Love explains the attraction of different forms of matter, and strife accounts for their separation. Okay? So this is not the kind of love na naamo si Moyab, okay, or the kind of love that you have for your crush. Love is just a concept that explains or pertains, or that explains the attraction between different forms, and therefore mo usa. Okay? Whereas strife accounts, or strife simply explains the concept in which things separate. Okay? Like, diba, if we take into example life again, so remember, ang kalag, the ancient Greeks have a concept of soul. Okay? And the soul is inside this body. And the soul is separate from the body. So the moment we die, according to how we even now think of death, atong kalag daw kay mo separate sa lawas. Okay? So, it is love, according to Empedocles, that the soul and the body are intertwined together. Okay? So, it is in the soul that our character is, and it is the body, which is the vessel, that actualizes what the soul desires. And it is strife that separates the body from the soul. Therefore, we have the concept of death. Okay? So, love and strife are always in this circular pattern of usahay ang love mo'y nasa taas, usahay ang kasakit mo'y nasa taas. Okay? So, it's similar to how Filipinos think of their own life, na usahay malipayon ka, usahay down ka. And that's why we say na usahay moingon ta na okay lang dili man ni madugay ning kasakit, kay eventually ang kasakit may himong kalipay. Diba? So, ang kuan nato diri is ang for Empedocles, excuse me. For Empedocles, the concept of arche, or the basic substance or the basic principles, is that change is still there, and that change takes root. Takes root on four unchangeable elements: earth, air, fire, water. So even though that these elements are unchangeable, dili man ang tubig man jud dili man jud makalayo. Okay? Ang tubig dili mahangin. I mean, scientifically speaking, if mo bukal kag tubig naman ma-humidify and mahimo siya air. But the point here is water will always be water as long as the principles of water are there. Okay? Kung ibukal nimong tubig, then air will always be air. And fire will always be fire. Earth will always be earth. And even though these are things that do not change, it contributes to the fact that there is change. Okay. When you die, you are buried. it's not the land that will change, it's your composition. Okay? Kung sakit yung tutunlan, it is water that changes ang sakit into fresh na ma-refresh. It's still water, diba? Dili mo change yung water, but because of water, ang kasakit sa mong throat mawala. Okay? Excuse me. Fire will always be fire. It may burn things, but the fire will not change, only the things that it burns. Alright? So, with that, that tries to explain that ang RK is actually still change. Whereas, the explanation is that the origin, the RK, is this what we call the roots. Okay? The earth, air, fire, water. With these unchangeable elements, there will always be change. Okay? With this unchangeable element, there will always be change. Okay? So even though that there are some aspects sa imong kinabuhi na are in life in general na pareha, there will always be individual lives that will change. Okay? Even though pabalik-balik ang proseso, di ba? Ang individual mismo ang magbago. Okay? Yeah, that's it. So again, if you're getting confused, you may always repeat the video. Okay? Next we have Zeno of Elea. Okay. So Zeno is particularly someone who actually is odd. Why? Let's consider what he has to say. So like Parmenides, he taught that the world of sense, with its apparent motion or change and plurality or multiplicity, is merely an illusion. Okay, so for him, he had the same concept as Parmenides, and that concept is that there is no real change. Dili magbag-o ang mga butang. Why? Because there is a static. It just looks like na nagbag-o, pero it's the same thing. So for Zeno, ang iyang kuan pod is, he has the same idea. Okay? Illusion ra daw ang lihok. So basically, ang paglihok ng kamot is an illusion. Para ani niya, wala dud galihok akong kamot. Okay? So why? So the true being behind the illusion is absolutely one and has no plurality or monism. And furthermore, it is static and unchangeable. Okay. However, because common sense tells us that there is both motion and plurality, as in the Pythagorean notion of reality, Zeno developed arguments to show that the common sense notion of reality leads to consequences at least as paradoxical as those of Parmenides. What does this mean? Okay, so even though na makitaan sa, common sense man jud no, ang kamot na ko diri na siya diri, but mulihok ko na siya diri, di ba? The thing is, when you look, and it's common sense no, nilihok jud ko, and ikaw nagatanaw, makaingon jud ka nagalihok jud ko, kini ako kamot, akong finger. But for him, this is just an illusion. Okay, there is still static, unchangeable daw gihapon ang reality na wala daw ko kalihok. Okay, so when you say plurality, there is a difference. Okay, in other words, there is a kadaghanan na pagbag-o, na kadaghanan na kuan konsepto, like I am one human being, but there is also a plurality of other human beings. Yan na bitaw. I am not the only human being in the world, but I represent that one concept of a human being. Okay, we continue. So Zeno developed arguments to show that the common sense notion of reality leads to consequences of at least as paradoxical as those of Parmenides. So underlying intention was to affirm that everything was one, as monism asserted, that all belief in plurality and change is mistaken, and in particular that motion is nothing but an illusion. To do this, he considered what would happen if something was divided into infinitely small amounts, showing that this inevitably resulted in a situation which made no sense and so must be wrong. Okay. Sorry. So, consider this. For Zeno and Parmenides in general, for Zeno Manggod, it's not more of a static, no, pero he asserts that things do not change. Same as Parmenides. For him, ang paglihok again is motion, is an illusion. So for him, if ang iaalang, if si Parmenides, he says that the one is static, ang iyaha is the one, okay, the one is something that is something where all of us are part of, okay, where all of us are part of. So one human being represents all human beings. That yan ang concept. Ikaw as an individual, you as a person, represent the entirety of human existence. Okay. For him, it only takes one concept of the human to understand, to show that there is only one motion and that doesn't change. Okay. Kaya at the end of the day, bahalag lain-lain tag kinaiya. Okay, bahalag ikaw madasigon, ako tapulan, bahalag siya palahubog, ikaw religyoso. All of us represent what it is to be a human being. Okay? So, ang pagkatapulan, ang pagkamadasigon, ang pagkaingana, these are all what we call illusions. Okay? Illusions to the fact that even though that we are all different in some way, we all represent what it means to be a human being. Okay? So, technically, ang tao, matao as a bata, and eventually mamatay somewhere in the future after he or she is born. And that is basically a representation of what life is. Something comes into being, something comes into existence, and later on mamatay siya. Okay? Excuse me. So, how is it that Zeno will say na walay change? Why? Kay ngano walay change na kung ang tao matao, then mamatay eventually, syempre mo change din siya. Okay? So, it is more or less not the fact that there is a physical change, but the fact that what that reality represents is the one that does not change. So a human being will always be a human being regardless kung unsa siya kabuutan or kadautan sa mata nato. Okay? He is born, he dies, and that is reality, and that doesn't change. Okay? Kita tanan kinahanglan mukaon, kita tanan kinahanglan mo inom tubig, kita tanan nanginahanglan lang ako sa kabutan na makapalipay sa tuwa. And all these desires of the human being is what represents every other human being. Okay? Excuse me. So, that is for plurality. How about motion? Why is it that kung mulihok ko, this, according to Zeno, I am not moving? Okay? According to Zeno, since there is what we call time and space, okay, it just so happens that within a second of my life, my hand is here. My hand is here. In the other second of my life, my hand is like this. Okay? Nakita ba? Okay? So for us, no, wala siya sense. It doesn't make sense. But for Zeno, for him, he tries to tell us that every simple action happens simply because at a particular time and space, ang imong matter go-occupy siya ana na space at a given time. So for him, para sa iya, wala din kagalihok. It just so happens na ang parte sa imong lawas, ang matter that is ikaw, is just occupying a space at a given point in time. Okay? So like for example, 1 o'clock na ako sa balay, 2 o'clock na ako sa syudad. So giingana ni ang pagsabot ni Zeno sa motion. Since motion is an illusion, it just so happens lang jud na what we think, the reality in which we think that we are moving is actually just our form, our matter, occupying a certain space in time. Okay? I'm repeating myself na di ay. Okay, so if you consider it now, if you look at a bigger picture according to Zeno, if you take all of this into infinitely small amounts, okay, so ang akong paglihok, ang imong paglihok, ang paglihok sa akong iro, ang paglihok sa jeep na nilabay karon, nagsaba kayo, then if you take that all into consideration, then ang ending kay, it's as if that we're not moving at all. Okay? Kapansin ka sa, when you go home late at night and there is a moon, di ba you notice that the moon being far away and you nagalakaw, you think that the moon is following you, di ba? So murag ingana ang concept na gusto ipasabot ni Zeno, ngano there is no movement really. Okay? Okay? So again, I just allow me to repeat myself. According to him, ang mass or ang matter that exists, the physical matter that is you, the physical matter that is this phone, it just so happens that this phone or this matter is occupying the space that is this space here at this time. Okay? And the moment na mawala siya, then it so happens na 1 second later, the matter or the phone no longer occupies that space but is now occupying the space on top of my table. Okay? Does it make sense for us? No. And that's okay. Basta we're just trying to discover what they're trying, how they thought life is, how they thought certain things are. Okay? So we're still at Zeno. Okay, so I hope that's understood. So basically, the archive for Zeno is, it can still be considered the one, only a different understanding, or we can say it's monism. Okay? Okay, so yun. Yes, so we continue. So while you're, this will be on YouTube kasi, so whoever is watching at the moment, if you're a philosopher or a student of philosophy, feel free to correct me. Okay, the point of philosophy is that we're always learning. Okay, so we move on. Now we have Democritus. Okay, excuse me. So Democritus, like many other pre-Socratic philosophers, the atomism of Leucippus and Democritus was largely a response to the unacceptable claims of Parmenides that change was impossible without something coming from nothing, which is itself impossible, and thus any perceived change or movement was merely illusory. Okay, so Leucippus or Leucippus or whatever is a contemporary of Democritus, and they believe in what we call atomism, and this is where we get the understanding of atoms. Okay, so in the atomist version, there are multiple unchanging material principles which constantly rearrange themselves in order to affect what we see as change. Okay? These principles are very small, indivisible, and indestructible building blocks known as atoms, from the Greek word atomos, meaning uncuttable, dili maputol. Okay? All of reality and all the objects in the universe are composed of different arrangements of these eternal atoms and an infinite void in which they form different combinations and shapes. Okay, so it is here that we come to understand the concept of atoms. Okay, so if you are a science major, then, or a science major, then here we appreciate how philosophers affect how we think now. Okay, so it is with the philosophers we come to understand what are atoms, why about cosmology, things like that. Anyway, so when you think of it now, this is something similar to another philosopher we discussed. Okay, the concept of change on the basis of things that do not change. Well, the basis of change on things that do not change. So unlike Zeno and Parmenides, where they say that illusion ran ang galihok kay constant daw jud tanan, for Democritus there is always change. Excuse me. And this change is attributed to atoms. And atoms are things that are eternal, according to him, eternal, unchanging, indivisible, and indestructible. Dili mo guba, dili makit-an, gamay kay sa ngatanan, dili ma separate. Okay? So basically, for Democritus, the atoms are what make up matter. So what makes up my hand? Atoms. What makes up me? What makes you up? Unsay ga paporma sa imong cellphone, sa imong laptop, okay? It is atoms. Okay? And atoms are different regarding on the matter. So ang atom sa hangin, lahi. Ang atom sa kalayo, lahi. Ang atom sa tao na physical, lahi po. Okay? So it just so happens that there are different arrangements. Okay? Sa pagkabata nimo, ang atoms kay very closely knit together. That is why you look fresh. Ang nawong sa bata lahi sa nawong sa tiguang. Okay? So at given points in time, that there are certain arrangements sa imong lawas, sa imong nawong, or in reality, that contribute to change. Okay? So kung na may butang na dili magbago, those are atoms. But atoms are what contribute to the change in reality. Okay? Atoms are what contribute to the change in reality. So, kung ang realidad sa bata kay smooth pa kay skin, that is because the atoms at that given point in time are formed that way. Later on, as the individual grows older, then the atoms will likewise rearrange. Okay? So, gets? They rearrange. That is why sa pagkabata, kung unsay nawong nimo sa pagkabata nimo, lahi na karon. And kung unsay imong nawong karon, lahi na pud na ini katiguang nimo. Okay? How you look in your youth is different how you look now, and how you look now will look different when you're old. Okay? Simply because there is always a different arrangement. Okay? So these eternal atoms and an infinite void in which they form different combinations and shapes. Okay? So, excuse me. So, diba, there is this concept that in every atom, the atom fills the void. Okay? So, for example, all of these are form atoms. The space in between my two fingers is what we call the void. Ang void is where nothing exists. There is no atoms there. It just so happens this is the space. Okay? And since there is a void around us, how we are shaped is dependent on, regardless of the void, regardless of where you are, the atoms that are in you rearrange given the void you are in. Siguro, again, that doesn't really give justice to what he really means, pero for the sake of us to for the sake of a better, or at least an attempt to make it quickly understood, no? Okay, so again, there are combination of shapes, and therefore because of this combination, each atom forms the way it is. So that is why bahalag pareho ang proseso sa pagkatao, even if the process of a human being is the same, consistent, regardless of the generation. Every individual, every human being is different. Akong nawong ingani tungod mo arrangement sa atoms na ako. Okay? Imo anang ang ingana imong nawong tungod ingana ang pag-arrange sa atoms sa imong nawong. Okay? So basically, that is how we look into atoms. I mean, that was how atoms were looked into by the ancient philosophers, particularly the Pre-Socratics. Okay? With that, we are done with the Pre-Socratics. On our next video, which will be quite short, we will look into the Sophists. Okay? So the Sophists, just a general overview, the Sophists are also Pre-Socratics. However, they are the contemporaries of Socrates. Okay? So, they do not belong to the Socratic era, simply because the way they thought is different from that of Socrates. Okay? Alright, so given that, I am thankful that if you're actually watching this, or if you are struggling and at least you've made it to the end of the video. So I am thankful that you took the effort to look into this, and I hope to see you in the next video. Stay safe, God bless, stay healthy, take care, bye bye.